Nomiki Show. Clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.
Hello and welcome to the Nomiki Show. It is Wednesday, August 18th. What a week. So I'm going to give you a quote. I'm going to give you a quote that came from President Joe Biden this week in response to how Facebook was dealing with misinformation and specifically disinformation, and how quickly and responsive they were to the rapid spread of disinformation, specifically regarding vaccines. Joe Biden said, quote, anyone listening to it, meaning the misinformation or the information on Facebook, is getting hurt by it. It's killing people. It's bad information. My hope is that Facebook, instead of taking it personally, that somehow I'm saying Facebook is killing people, that they would do something about the misinformation, the outrageous misinformation about the vaccine. And that is what I meant. There has been a tug of war between Facebook and the Biden administration this week about this misinformation. Let's play a clip, an interview with Gayle King from CBS News and Mark Zuckerberg. Let's roll that clip.
I get that you all have taken down 18 million pieces of misinformation, but one of the things that the White House has asked for repeatedly and still hasn't gotten a number is how much misinformation have people viewed and shared? Do you have that number?
Well, if we see harmful misinformation on the platform, then we take it down. It's against our policies. So the 18 million number that I shared is the number of pieces of content that that we've seen on the platform that we take down. Now, do we catch everything? Of course, there are mistakes that we make or areas where we need to improve, but that's the best number that we have in terms of what we've seen and what our systems have been able to detect.
But I do think those are two separate issues. You've taken down 18 million pieces of misinformation, but how many people have viewed the misinformation? Is it more than 18 million? Is it less than 18 million? That's the number I think people are talking about. You know, the White House said at one point, Facebook is killing people. That was very bold and very blunt and very provocative, and I think the president walked that back. But the point he was making, I believe, is that people look at it and they act upon it or they don't act upon it, and Facebook is being blamed for that. That's why I'm trying to nail down what is the number of misinformation that people have viewed. Maybe you don't know it. Maybe you all don't know that number.
So much is going on here. Kudos to Gayle King for at least trying to clarify how much misinformation was being spread. It's one thing to take down 19 million posts. You know how many posts go up a day on Facebook in the United States, not to mention globally. But for him saying that, we've taken down 19 million posts, at what stage did they take it down? How much harm had already been done? I am so glad that Gayle King asked that specific question. Well, how many views do they get? Now, Facebook, just to remind you all, has already had issues on how many views are accurate. You know, a few years ago, I remember we would post stuff at the conventions, other places on the Bernie Sanders campaign, and we would get tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of views with the surrogate circuit. I was the DNC, and there's nothing to compare to what we get now on Facebook. And later on, it came out that they were not posting the accurate numbers, that the views that were being perceived online were not necessarily reflective of the actual views, not to mention how many people stay on that link for longer than 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds. And at what point does the misinformation spread? So at what point of watching do people share it more? Does it even matter if they share it? Is it the headline? All of these questions are super important. But the bottom line here is Facebook knows. It's not like they're clueless. He makes it sound like, but the machines can't handle things. Of course they can, especially post 2016 and Cambridge Analytica. Mark Zuckerberg should be extremely thoughtful about how he presents this war against misinformation, taking down 19 million posts. What does that even mean? How many views? Is this after hundreds of millions of views? Is this after hundreds of millions of shares? Billions? We have no sense. How many minutes? How many hours have people watched this? Has it influenced certain areas where, I don't know, COVID rates are gone up because people aren't getting their vaccines? It'd be very interesting for a CEO who's already under attack for misinformation from 2016 to come forward and be upfront about these things. You know, the way he was when he answered the question of, this is amazing. I can't, let me get the quote. This is just too good, because on one hand, he says, oh, well, it's really hard for us to know how much misinformation was posted. We know how many posts we took down. We don't know how many people had seen it. It's been really complicated for us. This has been a really difficult thing for us to measure. But later on, he says, as of mid-July, more than 2 billion people viewed authoritative information about COVID-19 on Facebook, including 3.3 million Americans who used the vaccine finder tool to make an appointment to get the vaccine. When it makes them look good, they have the details. When they're caught, goodness gracious, we don't know. We're just a little company. There's just so many posts, we can't handle it. It's not like we take up, a major campus in Northern California and have offices in every single country that uses our. Okay, Mark Zuckerberg, it's up. The shtick is up. There are literally people dying because of the misinformation that's being spread, not just on Facebook, but Facebook is a major perpetrator of this. The fact that you boost and you allow the algorithm to grow off of this misinformation, that the top 10 media posts in the last month, how much of that was coming from right-wing media who's challenging the vaccine? And let me just guess, those hosts probably already have their vaccine. You are literally an accomplice to the monetization of misinformation about the vaccine. The people who are spreading the misinformation are doing so because they know that the business model supports it. I'm going to guess that the same people who are spreading this misinformation and are only doing it because the algorithms of Facebook benefit their pocketbooks in doing so, I'm going to guess that those same hosts have their vaccines. So really, it does come down to you, Facebook and Google and Twitter. It does come down to you. You are not a response to the politics. You are actually engineering the politics. You know that conspiracies sell. And right now, it's a prime opportunity to spread conspiracies, but at what cost? You might be making record money right now. But in 10 years, in 15 years, you know this ain't going to work out. You know very well that the algorithm in which you design benefits, supports conspiracy theories, tapping into people's weaknesses and their anger. Remember when, on the topic of Afghanistan, let's talk about just a few years ago, when we saw that there was a spread of radicalization online when it came to ISIS, when ISIS started to grow. The tech companies had no problem cracking down then. But now when the human race is being challenged, whether it comes to climate change, science denial there, spreading online, or vaccine denial or COVID denial, that is radicalization as well on the right. It's funny. It's really funny how when it comes to radicalization on the right, in some countries, you have no problem doing the responsible thing. But when it comes to radicalization on the right in capitalist countries parading as democracies, you don't take it on. At what point? At what point are you actually going to do something? So kudos to Joe Biden. I wish he hadn't walked it back. I wish he had leaned in a little bit more. Kudos to him for at least acknowledging or using his honest, the lack of a filter when it comes to honesty to say what so many know. The problem is he said it and he had to pull back. And that, I think, is ultimately the power that Facebook and these tech companies have over even the Democratic establishment. But it's got to stop. It's got to stop. This is how fascism spreads. Go back and look at the playbook. Misinformation, conspiracy theories, tapping into economic anxiety, taking on institutions which surely are not succeeding right now in terms of doing their role, playing into people's doubts, playing into people's sexism and misogyny and racism, and blaming the other. This is the toolbook. It's just formed in a different way with the internet. It's just facilitated faster. Mark Zuckerberg, you are not a small man. You are not just a little lowly entrepreneur. You are able to communicate to the hearts and minds and thoughts and frustrations and doubts and insecurities of almost every single person on this planet. Do the responsible thing. Don't make this about quarterly results and returns, making sure your investors get whatever they invested in more. Do this about, let's tap into your ego a little bit. Savior complex. If you want to actually make a name for yourself and be in the history books for something other than spreading misinformation and contributing to the pandemic, then maybe you do the right thing. You might actually be able to help fight climate change. If that algorithm, which is human designed, were to focus on spreading facts and using the psychology of spreading facts and how you message that, creating the algorithm from a place of good rather than a place of immediate profit. Because we know when we focus on immediate profit, we're focusing on hate and misinformation and doubt and blame and all the negative stuff. But if you, Mark Zuckerberg, want to come out as a savior because you're not looking good right now, you're looking like a Charles Lindbergh right now. You might have been known for something admirable at one point, but at the end of the day, the politics are what took him down. And I think, you have to think about that. So I'm actually just throwing this out to Mark Zuckerberg. I'm sure he'll see it. Do what's right. All right, we have a wonderful show today. Speaking of misinformation, it's so funny. We book these shows and we have no idea what's about to go down. In the first hour, we have Lee McIntyre on, who's a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University, who wrote a book called How to Talk to a Science Denier. And wouldn't it be interesting, and I'll ask him, how you incorporate that into the design of an algorithm? On one hand, you have how to convince people to challenge, to believe in conspiracies, how to tap into conspiracies and grow them. And on the other hand, you have the psychology of how to talk to a science denier and bring them over to the logical and fact-based side. But first, we have Ricardo Valadez, who is a private equity campaign manager at Americans for Financial Reform. He's going to talk about how private equity is taking advantage of this economic crisis and COVID and the infrastructure bill and everything right now and just seeping their tentacles into Washington right now to make sure that they get a piece of the pie. And then at the very end of the show, so excited to have the one and only Harvey Kaye. He was on last week. We didn't have enough time. We have plenty of time in the second hour with Harvey Kaye to talk about what Joe Biden's role has been, his response to Afghanistan, how his presidency is dealing with bigger issues like other issues, I should say, like the infrastructure bill, big issues like the infrastructure bill, and of course, following through on his promises. And then we might even throw a little bit about tech and populism, which is how we started off the show. All right, we will be right back after this brief little break to talk with the one, the only, Ricardo Valadez. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. Very excited to have Ricardo Valadez on. He is a private equity campaign manager at Americans for Financial Reform, which is a nonpartisan and nonprofit coalition of more than 200 civil rights, consumer, labor, business, investor, faith-based, and civic and community groups, which formed in the wake of the 2008 economic crisis. I'm old enough to remember that. and live it and experience it. Thank you so much for joining the show, Ricardo.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm fascinated by the work you're doing right now as it relates to the economic crisis that we're in now, involving private equity. So, but just before we get to like the present state of where we are, how much did private equity play a role in like the post 2008 economic crisis? Is private equity's sort of I don't know, craving for economic disasters or whatever it is, the opportunities attached to them. Is this a new thing that came out of 2008, or has it already existed?
Well, the industry existed before 2008, but they did take that economic crisis as a real growth opportunity. And, we have quotes from the time, from investor calls of private equity executives, really, getting excited and salivating at the devastation in the housing market, for example, that occurred after the 2008 crisis, and they really did take that opportunity to pounce on low prices. If you want to take the housing market, for example, they bought up tons of real estate and consolidated that to become the largest landlord in the country at one time, in the form of Invitation Homes, which now is still a major renter in the housing market, and they're poised to jump on the current crisis in the same way.
In the same way that they're expecting more foreclosures or more renters to leave. I mean, how does this kind of play out in this version of the housing crisis that we're facing? We just don't have an accurate number.
Yeah, so the private equity industry has been a major driver in the corporatization of housing, whether it's in manufactured housing or apartments or single family homes. They're continuing to invest heavily in the housing market, often crowding out individual buyers and small, mom and pop rental or landlords.
So let's conceptualize the crisis that we're in the midst of right now. If you live in New York, where I live, we're facing an eviction moratorium expiration very soon, and it's been mind-boggling to me because yes, rental rates have gone down, but they haven't gone down to the extent that we all thought. Landlords have received a little bit of support, but my immediate thought is, well, what about the small landlord? I live in Queens. There's a lot of small landlords there. Not as many as there used to be, but for the most part, there are plenty of duplexes and small apartment buildings that are owned by grandmas who invested there 50 years ago. Are they at risk of losing their property being bought up by these bigger companies?
Yeah, that is a real concern. One of the trends that we see in the housing industry when it comes to private equity is their ability to come in and make cash offers and buy properties, often well over asking price, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars over asking price, and that puts in jeopardy a lot of folks who may not have access to that sort of capital, right? Another trend we've been seeing is that, yes, there is the eviction moratorium is coming to an end, and we do expect, unfortunately, a wave of evictions. But another factor in that is that many corporate landlords not only have been, poised for evictions, but they've also been not extending leases, and so you will have a lot of folks who are evicted, but also folks who aren't able to extend leases. And what that allows them to do is really drive rental rates higher with new tenants.
And they've been doing this for years. It's not like this is a new concept. They'll find little ways within the loopholes to not to either just make sure that the apartments are like falling apart and people don't want to renew their leases or whatever it is, so that they can remodel it and double the price.
Yeah, and what we've seen, across this is not just an issue in housing. What we've seen across the private equity industry is that they're often involved in drivers of some of the worst practices, some of the worst and most egregious business practices that we see in the country, whether that's driving up prices in healthcare for consumers, like you mentioned, driving up rental rates, increasing fees, and squeezing renters. Or buying up retail and squeezing workers and driving bankruptcies across the economy. Private equity is responsible for some of the worst practices when it comes to workers and consumers.
So let's talk about healthcare. Obviously, can you explain how does this play out, and how does it kind of go head to head with this fight for Medicare for all, or stall on any real legislative focus on Medicare for all?
Well, private equity's role in healthcare has changed over the years, but wherever they get involved, what we've seen is higher prices for consumers, and often a lot of mess in the wake after they sort of walk away with profits. So a decade or so ago, they were interested in buying up a lot of hospitals. And so they bought a lot of hospitals, many community hospitals. And the result of private equity's involvement there was the closing of a lot of safety net hospitals. That the private equity business model is to really buy up assets, squeeze as much money as they can from them, and then offload them, whatever the result, right? So that could mean workers losing their jobs, communities losing their hospitals. Really, the private equity industry isn't concerned with what they leave behind. And so in healthcare, one of the trends we're seeing now is they've been engaged in a lot of what's called roll-ups in the healthcare space. So that what that means is they buy a lot of practices in, for example, dermatology or dentistry, and they'll roll them up into one big company. And then, they can manipulate prices and kind of create stealth monopolies in certain markets using those practices. So that's something we're tracking currently. Yeah.
So it seems really interesting. It's like they find, whether in the real estate aspect or even retail, I guess the same. If there is a crisis, an economic crisis, obviously, pandemic is a different type of crisis that created an economic crisis, or even a climate crisis, for instance, buying up distressed real estate that has, I look at Puerto Rico as a classic example, so it seems like there's the strategy of following the crisis and maybe not fighting some of the crises like climate change. But then simultaneously, there's this healthcare crisis where it's very clear that we have a broken healthcare system in our country, and they're capitalizing off that as well. Is this an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. One of the advantages that private equity has is that they sit on massive amounts of cash that they're able to deploy, and so they'll wait for whether it's low housing stock or an opportunity that they see to squeeze consumers and make money in healthcare or housing. They're really in every part of the economy, even in places you would never imagine. They're huge in entertainment. They just, for folks familiar with the Cirque du Soleil, private equity drove them into bankruptcy last year.
What do you mean by drove them into bankruptcy?
That's a good question. So private equity, one of the things that's key to private equity's business model is the use of debt to buy companies. And so if you or I were to go buy a house or a car and take out a loan or a mortgage, we would be responsible for paying that back. But the private equity business model relies on what's called a leverage buyout, in which the debt is placed on the company that's being bought. So the private equity firm itself has no liability for the money that was for the debt that was put on those companies. And so we saw that practice drive a lot of bankruptcies in retail, at a time when retail was going through transitions, to online, and the stores were changing. Private equity, bills itself as coming in and providing, leadership and capital, during those transitions. But what they actually do is pile on debt that makes it harder for those companies to transition, because they actually also have to pay the debt that was put on them, sometimes tens of billions of dollars in the case of Toys R Us and others. And so that practice drives bankruptcy, and they use debt not only to buy the companies, but they also can then force those companies to take on additional loans to pay back, to buy back stocks. And what that does is give them, make the private equity firms a lot richer, but saddles the company with additional debt that they have to service and pay back, and make it harder for them to survive. So that's one way they drive companies into bankruptcy.
So what's interesting about this, though, I'm, and forgive my naivete, like, the company is valuable enough for them to do all this and keep it alive to an extent. Is there some hope that once they take control, the company will rebound? And so they're making money in the crisis. They're creating a crisis for the company, or exacerbating whatever, predatory, and then take hold of the company because they still see the value in that company in the long term.
Yeah. So that does occur sometimes, but what private equity is really playing is a high reward, low stakes game. And because they can use debt that they're not responsible for, it puts them in a position to take a lot of risk. So if they put a tiny amount, 2 to 3% of their own money into a big deal, and drive about the deal with about 60 to 70% debt typically. And so if the company goes bad, they lose a small amount of money. But if it goes well, they still make money. And if it goes bad, often because of the ways they loot the company while they have it, they often still make money even if the company goes bankrupt.
It's a win-win-win-win-win-win-win-win-win.
Right, except for the workers and consumers who now are left, with no jobs, maybe no pensions or lower pensions, often no severance, and the communities that are left without beloved brands like Toys R Us and Payless Shoes. Yeah.
So let's talk about the workers. When private equity comes in, and obviously we're pivoting to retail. Retail has been affected in so many ways over the last, since online, since folks started buying things online, but also in this pandemic, even more so, as Amazon has done better than ever. Brick and mortar stores have just, like restaurants and every other small business. So how have workers been affected? Specifically, not, I guess let's separate the two. There's the pandemic problems, the problems of, companies not getting the business, and also, workers not being able to go into work. Aside from that, how have workers been affected by private equity swooping in and taking advantage of this situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, because private equity only cares about the short term, and squeezing the company for a short time, workers' pay and benefits and investment in the workforce is often, one of the first places they go to cut costs. So in retail, in brand after brand and store after store, what we've seen is, benefits being eroded, pay being squeezed, jobs being cut, stores being closed, and private equity finding ways to squeeze money for the short term, even if it makes the store less attractive to work there long term, but also to shop at. So we've heard from workers at stores when private equity comes in and buys a store that they may start spending less on some of the core processes that make the store look good or make the produce fresh in grocery stores, for example. And so again, that can undermine the long-term viability of the company, but the private equity company is not concerned about that because it helps their bottom line in the short term.
This is extremely horrifying.
Yeah, it is.
So we have the Biden administration now. Supposedly, they're going to be taking consumer affairs and taking on Wall Street a little bit more seriously. Is this happening? Is there any sign that that's actually there, especially in an economic crisis like this? I mean, you can't move slowly on things like this.
Yeah, there are certainly opportunities, for us to rein in the industry. There are, regulatory things that the administration can do, and then there's also, opportunities to pass legislation that would fundamentally change the business model, and stop some of the worst practices, limit their ability to pile on debt. Change bankruptcy law so that workers are, not as vulnerable when bankruptcies do occur. And so there really are some opportunities now. And there's a growing awareness of the industry and their role in the economy. So, yeah, we do see some opportunities.
Fascinating. Ricardo, I would love to have you back on to talk more to see how this evolves in the next few months and if the Biden administration and Congress decides to take this seriously enough to do something big and bold. But really great conversation and, keep up the amazing work.
Thank you so much.
Not easy.
Would love to be back.
Sounds good. Thanks, Ricardo. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. Lee McIntyre is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science, I emphasize science, at Boston University. And he's the author of How to Talk to a Science Denier. Lee, thank you so much for joining. This is, I feel like, a topic we should just be discussing every single day, hoping that maybe it just hits one more person or two more people or three more people, because that's how significant this crisis of science denial is at this moment, whether it's pandemic or climate change or, other things that could be coming. So thanks for joining us, Lee. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
So, okay. Our audience knows I've been in Greece, and just a little update for the audience. There are now over 540 fires since we first started talking about the fires, which is a little over 2 weeks ago, where there were over 100 fires in Greece. And the political situation here, which I think relates to many parts of the globe, is you have a center-right government that was dependent on a far-right science-denying faction to go into their coalition to be able to win against what was, in at least Greece, the left government. And this government in particular, center-right government of Mitsotakis, ran against the last government in how they handled one wildfire. So it's fascinating because this is obviously our problem in the States, is that we have loose coalitions of many different political factions, but one that happens to be holding us all hostage right now, whether it's denying vaccine science or COVID science or mask science or just science. And of course, climate change. I mean, these fires are not unique to Greece. It's happening in Northern California. And, we know this is, we're on the science side here. Is this about convincing people anymore? I mean, I feel like these are the folks you just can't convince and they're just keeping us hostage. Does it matter anymore?
I think it always matters to talk to people. And one important thing to realize is that science denial exists on a spectrum. And that, by the way, when you're talking to a science denier, don't use the word denier. I mean, I used it for the title of my book, but no one considers themselves a science denier. Some of them actually can consider themselves skeptics or, more scientific than the scientists. But it does help to speak to them, because you shouldn't assume going in that they're hardcore and that they can't be converted. And you know what? Even if they were, there are some anecdotal accounts of hardcore climate deniers being converted. And here's the really fascinating thing. When that happens, it always happens in the exact same way, which is that they talk to somebody that they trust. The science denial is not just a crisis of facts, it's a crisis of trust. And so what do the facts matter? What magic words can you say to somebody to convince them? If they don't trust you, how do you build trust? Face-to-face conversation, calm, respect, patience, listening. Very hard to pull off, but it can work. It doesn't work in every case, but it can work.
This reminds me of just old school political organizing. When you're doing door to door, you figure out, okay, maybe there's somebody who I can move because they're part of my community, they're part of my church. And this is actually what the right wing has been very effective at doing, is organizing within churches. But it could be your neighbor. It could be, this was well known to work with the LGBTQ movement when they were fighting for marriage equality, was friends and family. You'd find out that someone like a Dick Cheney could be moved because his daughter came out. Why hasn't this tactic has it been utilized with climate, for instance, to its effect? And simultaneously, I say this, it's one thing to reach out to them that way, but the radicalization that's happening online just seems to be happening at a much faster pace. And can you have these two things at the same time?
It is a challenge, right? Because the friends of science have to scale up, because we're trying to catch a moving train here. But the good news is that it is possible. And in fact, you put your finger right on it. The best possible means of convincing somebody is somebody who already trusts you. Somebody where it's very hard with a stranger to try to build trust. But if somebody already trusts you, then you've got a little bit of an open door. And then the thing is, don't exploit the closeness that you have with the person to insult them, to make, to defy that trust. I was just hearing a story the other day about a young woman who was talking to her father about climate change, and he was just intransigent, just whatever facts she presented. And then she finally said, "Dad, why do you trust all these people that you've never met, but you don't trust your own daughter?" And that did the trick. So, that was an emotional appeal. It was not a factual appeal, but notice what happened. She went with the trust issue first, and then all of a sudden, all of the factual issues fell into place. If we think that the best way to confront a science denier is just to cram facts down their throat because they don't know them, that's wrong, and it will not work. And in the polarized environment that now exists over, COVID and climate change and other things, it just won't work. What's going to work, if anything will, is building trust, engaging people face to face, and not avoiding difficult conversations.
This reminds me of Drew Weston's work, The Political Brain, who wrote about this maybe a decade ago, about how Bill Clinton, for instance, was so effective at communicating to voters that wouldn't necessarily, specifically it was all voter related, but at the end of the day, it's all the same mechanism as you're trying to sway people. And he would appeal to their emotions or tap into something very personal to connect with them. But that's also how coalitions are built. And if this is a political crisis as much as it's a messaging crisis, as much as it's a science crisis. So just for folks, watching who, all right, we all believe in science. We all want to move people. We all have family members that may not agree with us. And maybe we fought with them online and maybe that's not the right strategy. It maybe does have to be more in person. But what are some of the tricks of the trade that you could share with folks watching right now?
I guess the main thing to say is that in a human face-to-face encounter, listening counts for a lot. And it's hard. It's hard to listen and not interrupt somebody when they're telling you about some giant conspiracy theory that you think, well, I'm going to deplatform this right now, that just by listening, that you're, giving it oxygen. That's not the case. Don't let them think that they've convinced you. But the human tendency is that when somebody is, no matter how rabid they are about a topic, they will eventually stop and say, well, what do you think? Have I convinced you? And then that's your opportunity not to say you're a fool or to argue with them, but maybe to ask questions. Because again, the anecdotal accounts that I've read have to do with people asking a question. The young woman I just told you about was somebody who had asked a question. And so one of my very favorite questions that I will use, and I use this on flat earthers, by the way, so this is against hardcore science deniers, is I'll let them present whatever they want to say. And usually it has to do with evidence, the evidence for climate change, the evidence that the CDC is corrupt, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'll ask them this. It seems to me that your beliefs are based on evidence. Is that right? And they'll say yes. And then I'll say, well, if that's true, what evidence could I present to change your mind? What would have to be true to show that you were wrong? And they tend not to be able to answer that. Or let me put it this way, it makes them think for a moment. And then if they can't answer that question, don't fill the space. Just let them sit with the ability not to answer that question for a moment. And that's an uncomfortable couple of minutes when they realize, wait a minute, if no matter what the evidence is, I'd still believe this. Maybe it's not based on evidence. Maybe it's faith. Maybe it's ideology. Maybe it's politics. I'm just not going to give up my views. Make them a little uncomfortable.
So you mentioned faith, and that was my next question. There's so much identity, and I understand that you say there's a spectrum, which is really important. Yes. Because we all have family members, of course, I'm sure, and friends through our lives that, there doesn't seem like there's much to move them. And it's almost as if their beliefs have become their identities.
Yes.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So it's one thing to challenge somebody about a couple of ideas and maybe they're more flexible and willing to communicate. But then there are folks who their beliefs are their identities. And that could be religious identity. It could be a Trump supporter now. I mean, whatever Trump says, they'll take because it's their identity. It's their community. It's how they feel they belong in a time of crisis. They may have joined because they were seeking at one point, but now it is their lives. So how do you, are those people that you can sway at this point? Or are those the ones we say, okay, we can't reach them, but we can reach these other folks?
It's if you can tell in advance, I take my hat off to you because you don't always know. Sometimes people are the hardest core until that moment when they say, well, I guess I was wrong. And that happens, right? So, there's a famous case of a U.S. member of Congress, Jim Breidenstein, who was such a hardcore climate denier that he gave a speech in Congress about, with all these false claims that, climate deniers make. And so, of course, Trump appointed him to be the head of NASA, because what else would you do with a climate denier? Within a month, Breidenstein changed his mind publicly and said he had been wrong. Now, why? I think it's because he said he read a lot. Well, he had read a lot before, but all of a sudden he was supervising all of these NASA scientists who were not the evil other anymore. He knew them on a first name basis. He was their boss. He hung out with them in the halls. He had lunch with them and began to realize that these are pretty trustworthy, dedicated people and could change his mind. So you are absolutely right that when you attack a science denier's beliefs, you are attacking their identity. It's not just what they believe, it's who they are. If you attack a scientist's beliefs, they may be irritated with you, but if you've got the evidence and they're scientists, they're supposed to change their mind. But with a denier, it really, as I said, it's not about evidence in the first place. As you said, it's about identity. So, but is it possible to change someone's identity? Yes, but that tells you the scope of the problem. It's hard, right? In order to change someone's identity, in order to have them give up one of those core beliefs about Trump or vaccines or climate or whatever it is, you have to take the long game. You can't just, tell them they're stupid, give them a few facts and move on. That's just not going to be a productive conversation.
I've personally found when influencing, when trying to bring people into the circle of communicating about science and facts, it helps to sometimes dismantle the provider of the information.
Yes,
they're giving. So, for instance, if they're getting their information from, an easy one, Fox News and Tucker Carlson, immediately, if it's about science, say, it's interesting that, oil companies are the ones backing the show, or also with Tucker Carlson, if he's talking about income inequality, be like, this is somebody who grew up in wealth. As he's making, $60 million a year, are you going to take advantage in these? So sometimes I feel like that helps, but is that really a good tool? Or is that just something that makes me feel better?
If you can challenge the credibility of a denier's source, that is always to the good. The problem is that one of the tropes of science denial is that they rely on fake experts and denigrate real experts. So you're attacking their sources, they'll attack your sources. I had an email exchange with a guy the other day where he made some outrageous claim about COVID. And I said, please provide me your source. And he did. And it came just from where you'd expect. And I said, well, now, turnabout's fair play. I'm going to provide you some sources. And he said, yes, but they can't be academic, scientific, or governmental. I don't trust those. What can you do in a situation like that? So if it's possible for you to undermine somebody's source, that's good. By the way, when you're entering one of these conversations, it's important for you to have reliable information. And the Yale Climate Coalition has got a terrific website where you can go. They've also got a working paper I remember reading about this whole problem of the spectrum. They divided the science deniers up into 7 or 8 different categories. Some of which you could persuade and some of which you couldn't. And they sometimes give scripts for what you can do. So that's very good. And there are a couple of other websites that, the work of John Cook, who's a cognitive scientist. He's really done a lot of work on climate change and, how to talk to people about it.
Now I think the question is, how do we talk to folks? Because it is much more than, climate change is a policy issue right now. I mean, we need to actually have real politics that shift the way that we handle, and prepare for climate change. But the vaccination's also a policy issue, but there are folks who, no matter how much you try, they're not going to get vaccinated. And it is going to continue to spread, maybe at different rates, maybe in a different, but we're seeing how the variants are affecting with solely the unvaccinated folks who are really, exacerbating this. So this is the crisis of the moment, and but we're not going to be able to convince everybody, surely. So how do we? What's the best tool with the spectrum at this point?
It's shocking, isn't it? And the parallels between climate change and COVID are really overwhelming. I mean, I remember, I study this. And at the time when COVID denial started, I thought, well, now finally, people are going to understand that when it's a global crisis and it can affect our lives, they need to take it seriously. And then I watched in real time as that disintegrated. People won't even take a vaccine to save their own life, let alone, change their oil consumption habits to save the Maldives or, their own country in the future, or even now as Greece is on fire. And I'm speaking to you from Portland, Oregon, where we had the largest fire ever in the history of the state, the bootleg fire. So there are things. Sorry, I lost track there for a second. Rephrase the question.
Just in terms of the spectrum, I mean, it's one thing, you don't have to hit every climate denier to be able to change policy on climate, just enough to be able to influence it.
Yes,
but in the case of a vaccine and a pandemic, you really, most people need to actually do their part. Otherwise, we're just going to be in this forever.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's frustrating because, as I said before, there aren't any magic words that you can say to a vaccine denier, to a COVID denier. And I think you have to use the same methodology that I've been talking about. As people are polarized, I mean, you're seeing terrible stories these days about, there was something in California the other day about a fight, a fist fight in public over COVID vaccines. That's not going to convince anybody. And I mean, tempers are getting hot on both sides. There was a very interesting, here's something I can offer that's optimistic. There was a focus group done by a GOP, a Republican pollster named Frank Luntz, where he had a focus group of people who, I'm not going to say they were vaccine deniers, but they were skeptical. They didn't want to get they hadn't been vaccinated yet. They didn't want to get the COVID vaccine. And he was trying out different messages to see what might work for them. And what I think he stumbled upon was that by listening to what they had to say about their reasons, they ultimately became much more malleable. So he was looking at, the different groups that he had in, politicians, scientists, different people, to speak to them through video message, and which one worked and which didn't, trying to measure that. I think the effect was that he was taking them seriously and listening to them. Now, the one message that did break through, that they said broke through, was from a scientist who took his time and said, look, science doesn't know everything. Here's what we do know. And here's why we changed our mind on this. And, here what the statistics are. And, he approached them in a very human way, not in an authoritative, I'm a scientist, so you better listen to me, but just sharing information. By the end of that focus group, 19 out of 20 of the people had changed their mind and had said that they were more likely to take their COVID vaccines. There is a way to do this, okay? But it requires the right method and the right message and a patient person to do it. And, it's easy to get despondent about it. It's easy to get angry. I get angry, but to show it, and when you're trying to convince someone, it just turns them off.
Oof. Amazing advice. And of course, being in the media, we're taught to fight. So,
well, I'm a philosopher. We've been known to get into some battles as well.
I've heard in the place of philosophy right now. With that being said, I applaud, I can't believe I'm saying this out loud. I applaud Frank Luntz because just by asking people to be part of a focus group, I mean, that alone it became a vehicle to open folks up and make them more amenable, which, whether that was his intention or not, it ended up working out. So like, what's that old line? Meet people where they are and then take it from there.
If you ask somebody for their opinion, you flatter them. Yes. And then they're more likely to want to know what your opinion is. It's when I was at that Flat Earth convention, I was quiet the first day, but then when I started to speak and they knew who I was and, were suspicious as hell, I still would when I entered a conversation, would let them speak first. I mean, what else was I going to do? There were 650 of them. There was one of me, but it always happened in that conversation that after I let them spout off everything that they thought was convincing evidence, and then I still shut up. I didn't just jump in with 10 reasons they were wrong. I just kept quiet. They'd say, "Don't you think I'm right? Doesn't that make sense?" And then I'd say, "Well, I have a few questions." And I didn't convince anybody on the spot, but I did get them to listen to me. And I got them to be curious about what I thought, which if I'd come in there just, bowling them over, never would have happened because these were strangers and I was in a hostile environment. Right. And it was a searing experience, but I did it because I wanted to learn how to talk to the hardest core deniers so that I could then go talk to climate deniers.
Exactly. It's so interesting about this. Just as we wrap, I've watched some of these interviews with, and actually on our show, we've interviewed hostage negotiators.
Yes.
Folks who go into, whether it's Syria, as one of our guests and had to find hostages or dealing with radical cult leaders who've held hostages, or, the more traditional hostage negotiation. Like you said, it's you let them talk, you ask questions, and then you build that trust. And then little by little, you may be able to move them over to your side. And I'm sure lawyers experience that too when they're negotiating. Everybody, it's negotiation, essentially.
Lawyers are sometimes a little more hostile, but the hostage negotiator is good. Some literature that I've read on deprogramming people from cults. Ooh. Quite interesting, the tactics that they use. Not bad tactics to use for this purpose as well, because if you think about it, science deniers have been indoctrinated. Right. They didn't come up on their own with the idea that there were microchips in the vaccine. They read that somewhere. And you know what? That lie was created by someone for a purpose.
That's right.
The disinformation is intentionally created because it serves somebody else's purpose, and then it gets out there and gets amplified. And science deniers are victims in many cases because they believe this stuff. And if you remember that, it can help you have some empathy in these conversations with them.
What a great way to end us. Having a perspective that you come at it as if they're victims. And it's predatory. I mean, it's ultimately that's it. This is somebody who you talk about the man behind the curtain. So many folks think that, yes, and they're preying on you to your own demise.
To a conspiracy-minded person, that might just do it.
Yeah. There you go. It's like flip the script. I hate to tell you.
Yeah. Now, I mean, there is some evidence that I have to say it's not a conspiracy theory. There is some evidence that this disinformation is being created by nameable individuals. Right. And there aren't that many of them out there to do it. They just get it amplified all over Twitter and social media, and that's it.
Couldn't agree more. We'd love to have you back on. I don't feel like this is going to go away anytime soon. So maybe we can talk about some of those, the agendas of some of the folks spreading this misinformation and how it's facilitated, because that's a whole other topic that I'm fascinated by. But we need like an hour for that. So
thank you. I would enjoy that. Thanks very much for having me on your program.
Of course. Thank you so much. Take care. Sunset Lake CBD is a farmer-owned company that ships craft CBD products directly from their farm in Vermont to your door, wherever you are. Sunset Lake CBD has all types of products for everyone. They offer tinctures and gummies and salves and coffee, all designed to help with stress, aches, and pains. They actually took a Ben & Jerry's farm, talk about progressive, like they found the most progressive farmers in Vermont, and they decided to flip it and diversify it by growing premium hemp. And when you support as a customer Sunset Lake CBD, you're supporting sustainable agriculture that enhances rural economies and creates meaningful employment in the community. And by meaningful employment, they're starting wages at $15 an hour, and their employees own the majority of the company. And on top of all that, they support independent media like The Nomiki Show, like The Majority Report, and of course, David Pakman over at The David Pakman Show, who has 16 years since he's launched his show. I just saw that today. Congratulations, David. All sorts of fun products. They have a new dog biscuit out. Humans can eat it too. We've talked about that a little bit, but they have no artificial colorings or flavorings, and the ingredients, I think there's only like a few ingredients, like peanut butter, pumpkin, and oat flour. I think that's it, just 3. So if you can eat all 3 of those, you can eat those dog biscuits with your dog. Because I know a lot of people like to do everything with their dog. Maybe not everything. Well, who knows? You might be into that. I, of course, am a big fan of the tinctures. They help me sleep through the night, especially during hot nights in the summertime, when you may not have proper air conditioning, which is something that I was dealing with the last few nights, but I was able to sleep through. I just had a little bit of CBD and then woke up in the middle of the night, put a little bit more in, and I was able to sleep through the night. The gummies do the trick as well. They're delicious. I can't control myself, though. That's the only thing, is that I don't believe you can eat like 1. You have to eat like 7 or 8 or 9 or 10. I feel the same way about the chocolate. So I try to stick to the pure stuff, whether it's the hemp, smoking it, or of course the tincture. And of course there are There are salves that can help with like aches and pains, everything else, but you can do the coffee as well. But the chocolate, the sweet stuff, I limit because it's delicious. All right. You can get 20% off of your order if you go to sunsetlakecbd.com and type in NOMI, NOMI, capital NOMI. Go to sunsetlakecbd.com and type in NOMI for 20% off. And make sure to say that we sent you over there. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. Oh, look who it is. Professor Harvey Kaye. We did not have enough time with you last week, and we were going to talk about something completely different. But of course, in the meantime, the world blew up. Every week it blows up.
Once a week. Yeah.
Once a week, sometimes twice a week.
Yeah.
We're lucky enough. I'm kidding. If some in the news are lucky enough, not us, 3 times a week. Professor Harvey Kaye is, of course, Professor Emeritus at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. He is the author of Thomas Paine, The Promise of America, The Fight for Freedoms, Take Hold of Our History, Make America Radical Again, and FDR on Democracy, and so many other books. You have Take Hold of Our History in the background, which is, I think, important right now.
Yeah.
Professor Harvey Kaye. Harvey, so I want to discuss Afghanistan, but this is a huge topic. So I want to kind of put it in the confines of something I've been struggling with personally online. And I don't know how much of this is authentic or some of it is actually pushed out there to create these divides. But, and we'll reference some points too, because, the media is not doing any favors to these, to having these discussions either. President Biden, of course, pulled out of Afghanistan, not overnight. Obviously, this is something that has been going on. Right. The Trump administration set it forward, but it seemed as if it was a little haphazard. With that being said, there is a real substantive conversation about 2 things, right? There is a refugee crisis. There are women, in particular, feminists, who are being put at major risk right now by the Taliban.
Yeah.
And then simultaneously, there is a conversation about, well, we need to get out. And I think sometimes what gets jumbled in this conversation about getting out is, do we need to get out because we need to be right about imperialism? Or do we need to get out because we're putting too many resources in and it's not going anywhere? And so I'm left. I believe that we should have never gone into Afghanistan, just to put that on the table to begin with, because you know how left audiences work. I believe that we should have never gone into Afghanistan. I believe that we should have gotten out of Afghanistan. I believe that President Biden did not think deeply, in his administration, did not think deeply about what it would take to get out. And I feel as if this is a Ben Rhodes strategy, perhaps, that mirrors some of the Obama hands off of Syria, Obama hands off of Libya. And I say that because there were never boots on the ground. And there was a lot of conflict. And so there's a lot here, not to mention China, which we'll get to, I guess, a little bit later. So I just threw that out there, like vomited this all out. And Harvey, I mean, how are you dissecting all of this?
Well, let me say, first of all, that I'm 20 years ago, when I was 50 years old. So I was middle-aged, right? And it was striking at the time. And let me be honest, I don't even know quite often how well I can speak as an intellectual on the subject, because I won't deny that when the trade towers came down, okay, that clearly American military action was warranted. I have no reservations in saying that. But it did seem to me that the Bush administration just went wild in the course of the wake of 9/11, because not only, let's start, I mean, strictly objectively, without any kind of political bent, let's be objective about it. Number one, that's an administration that not only decided they were going to go into Afghanistan, which I'll suspend, but they also decided at the very same time, they're going to cut taxes massively for the very rich. Okay. People forget that because of the Trump tax cuts.
Yep.
And then at the same time, target Iraq, supposedly for weapons of mass destruction. And we know the disaster that became. Now, let me make it clear as well that there were good reasons for some kind of involvement in both locations. I mean, the Kurds, it's always funny how, and I make this seriously, how the left just doesn't talk about Kurdistan. Okay. And I remember that distinctly because a friend of mine had gone in and recorded the gassing of the village, not the actual gassing, but in the wake of the gassing, she recorded on film the devastation wrought. I mean, it was those kinds of things. Now, similarly in Afghanistan, the case in Afghanistan, we had no business believing we were going to turn it into any kind of stable quasi-democratic republic. And you could feel it, as those of us who actually know anything about history, you could feel it at the time, as we know the kind of wreckage that empires have discovered when they go into Afghanistan. Okay. And in the case of the prior empire that went in, the Soviet Empire, we actually underwrote, forces to help drive them out that later, of course, were then weaponized with our own military equipment. I mean, the whole thing was
those forces being the Taliban.
Yeah, those kinds of forces, exactly. So, I mean, one could just feel it. Okay, I want to say that one thing that popped into my head recently was I vaguely recollect John Kerry. I believe it was John Kerry at the time talking about, and maybe it was one of the other senators, sort of liberal Democratic senators, saying, let's not go in. Let's treat this as a police action. Okay, you're probably too young to.
What does that mean?
That would mean you send in some kind of coalition of special forces to get Al Qaeda. To get Al Qaeda.
Okay, hang on a second, because I want to. This is nuance is everything in these kinds of conversations, and you've mentioned a couple of things to me that stand out, right? The denial of gas attacks, or ignoring, I should say, not denial. Maybe in some cases denial, but in some cases just ignoring the gas attacks in Iraq. Not saying that. Let me be very clear. It's not justified going in Iraq.
This is against the Kurds.
Against the Kurds, exactly. So a denial of human rights violations. So, obviously the U.S. went into Iraq under a Republican administration. Obviously, Reagan armed what was to end up being the Taliban to fight the Soviets at the time. In the case of Obama, obviously the United States was on board with NATO intervening in Libya, but no troops were on the ground. It's important to distinguish these things because it's how the center left and the center tried to appear to learn its lessons from what clearly the right and the center right were doing aggressively to make money off of it. So I think, I'm looking at this Afghanistan situation to myself and Trump.
And by the way, one other thing we shouldn't also forget that there was I sometimes flip the names, the Gulf War in 71, not 71, 91, 92. Right. Yeah. George Bush's father. George H.W. Bush. Okay. Who literally was able to create a massive coalition of forces. That's right. And was also determined not to go into Iraq, or at least to withdraw and not take it all the way to Baghdad.
That's right.
So, and then look, I mean, one could argue about that overall, but I remember that the Marxist scholar at the LSE, Fred Halliday, and I were two of the rare people on the left who actually supported the idea of the Gulf War at the time, because there, whether we like the Kuwaitis or not, as a kingdom, the international community cannot stand by and watch one country conquer another. It's just
so let's explain this more. I mean, this ultimately, and I'm grappling with this myself personally. I have to say this, let's go back to Kuwait in a second, but I want to use Syria as an example. I would say the broad left is in agreement that Assad is a murderous dictator.
As was his father, who has ruined, whether it's like the history
of the birthplace of one of the birthplaces of civilization. I'm in Crete right now, so I can't, ignore the Minoans.
Murdered tens of thousands of their own people.
Murdered tens of thousands of their own people. And then simultaneously, there are folks who have, I believe, interest in denying gas attacks happened. But this is a playbook that has existed. This isn't a new playbook.
Right.
With the intention to prevent any sort of American involvement, which I, as being somebody who is not an interventionist, I feel, and by the way, that was what Obama did. Not, ignoring that he sent more troops into Afghanistan. Like, there's so much that he did do in other ways too. But you could feel the fear from him when it came to the Mideast, given the mistakes of Iraq and how he came into power.
Sure.
Don't forget, he was an anti-Iraq war, activist.
Right.
And that's sort of how he differentiated himself from Hillary Clinton. So he's afraid of doing anything, forget about intervening, afraid of doing anything with Syria and afraid of doing anything with Libya. And as a result, you had open borders in Libya. You had folks who were just picking up weapons left and right and shooting their neighbors and shooting their brothers and, seriously, and creating a position where ISIS could come in, seize oil fields and fund ISIS for the next 10 years off of Libyan oil and obviously other places too. Simultaneously, you have Syria, where Assad could, smelled an opportunity and as do other world powers. So I feel like sometimes on the left, we simplify things like U.S. empire bad, everything else non-existent.
I won't make any friends.
All are bad.
I'm not going to make friends.
All are bad.
Right. I won't make any friends on the left when I say this, that sometimes we grab hold of words to completely lambaste a situation. And it, as a consequence, immediately sets up yes and no response. So the word imperialism, okay? The United States has operated as an empire and it's done terrible things in those terms. But it's also the case that, it's not like any other major force in the world are the good guys. And the question, and let's not also forget that we are a very diverse people and there are folks who have interests that will express themselves in Washington, that will influence things. And unfortunately, however, the biggest powerful interests have been the military-industrial complex. Boom. Okay. And in fact, I kept wondering to myself what the accountants for the military-industrial complex were doing as they watched Afghanistan fall, if they were calculating their next set of expenditures. That's a sidebar of my perverse fantascy.
It's not perverse at all. That's exactly.
No, it's not.
There are folks who've been posting how much the military contractors. I'm sorry to interrupt, Harvey, but my immediate response in the beginning when Biden said he was pulling out of Afghanistan, the automatic American skeptic in me was like, oh, great. I can't wait to see how many Eric Princes or neoliberal Eric Princes, because we're factionalized here in our country, go in and swoop in on this opportunity and send private forces. But
hey, listen, when the embassy in Kabul was evacuated, it wasn't emptied. Civilian contractors were still in the embassy. And I always say to myself, this first time I really encountered this idea of civilian contract wasn't in the case of Iraq. And, they're essentially mercenaries. And I thought, however bad we are, when we're going to be fighting wars with mercenaries, we're really falling back into the worst case scenarios of empire. So, No,
this is literally like Christopher Columbus was a mercenary. To an extent.
Yes. Well, in that sense, it's sort of pre-mercenary.
He's a private contractor.
Well, the only thing to remember about in those days is that nation states were really in formation. So, Columbus didn't sail for, what was it? He was from Genoa, Columbus. He sailed for Spain because that's where the money was to outfit a voyage. Okay. So a lot of these, I think the first real sort of nation states were probably Britain and France and in some ways the United States, because prior to that they were sort of multinational monarchical, states.
So okay, let's kind of like dig in a little bit more. We are an empire, undeniable. Yeah. We have been able to, in coalition with other powerful forces, much smaller countries than ours, create some sort of quote unquote world order that suits the advantage of these forces. I'm being very intentional with my words, right? So whether it's Saudi Arabia and Israel, I can't think of anybody else right now that has that kind of power.
I want to make one thing clear, okay? Again, this isn't going to make any friends on the left. The existence of Israel was not exactly predicated on American empire. The Soviets had Israel was not created because the United States created Israel. It's just not the case. Okay. But it has become the case that the regime in Israel, okay, which is obviously right wing and on occasion almost authoritarian. And I won't get into the debate about should we designate Israel an apartheid state or not. I just won't do that. But it is the case that the United States, yes, is an empire, and it has this odd bedfellows coalition. But by the way, the Middle East is so complex. It's the case that the Gulf states would probably and have already shown their willingness to deal with Israel far more than some others. The Saudis hate the Jordanians. They with the British, pushed the Jordanians out of the Arabian Peninsula to what's now Jordan. The Jordanians have always, by the way, the Jordanians long just literally marginalized the Palestinians in Jordan. Most people will not remember because they're too young. Black September in the early 70s. I mean, it's so complex. Let's not treat Afghanistan as part of the Middle East either. That's a big mistake people make.
This is a beautiful lesson here, right? So our political, our spectrum is so limited in the US. Political spectrum, meaning coalitions being built, factions, et cetera, how we build these coalitions. So just our basis of understanding politics is so much more, it's like bifurcated compared to everywhere else on the planet that has some semblance of a democracy. Then add to it the layers of geography. I mean, we have two countries around us, two very, very, very different countries around us that are our allies, whether or not we treat them fairly or not, or work with them fairly or not. And then we have two ginormous oceans. And that's that old line, right? The biggest gift and the biggest weakness of strength and the weakness of the US is our
one of FDR's biggest challenges was to persuade Americans that the two oceans were not creating the fortress that Americans imagined. Okay. In the age of everything from submarines to bombers that could literally take off from, anywhere and cross an ocean. So,
I'm Pearl Harbor didn't.
Well, that depended on aircraft carriers, right? And of course, that was still at that point. Hawaii was our colony in the Pacific. So
Hawaii being colony Pacific. Okay. I
didn't mean to go off into that.
No. This is fascinating.
Well, actually, as long as you mention it, I will tell you that one of the things I actually was in international. I don't tell people this, but
I know this.
My graduate program really. I did a minor undergraduate. I did a graduate program, which was a lot of IR, and one of the reasons I left is that the world was so complex that IR theories to me collapsed. Okay. And it's also the case that my interest became more and more a question of class struggle questions as opposed to global kinds of questions.
What time period was this though? Because I think this is a really important point.
So I was a grad student in the sort of early 70s through 75, 76. And, but I really got so turned on to questions out of Marxist thought that I really was interested in the class struggle between landlords and peasants in Latin America, labor questions in the United States. That sort of so I retreated, you might say, from global affairs. But having said that, one of the things that's striking to me is this is true for so many different folks that we forget geography. It's striking. So can I move us a little bit just towards Afghanistan?
Yeah, that's why I mentioned we have because our political system is so simplified by design, and because of our geography is simplified. We as Americans have a simplified kind of understanding of how everything's playing out right now, and the multidimensional aspects of who's
Right.
Which bad actor is worse than the other bad actor, and why, just being there prevents another bad actor or whatever. I mean, so
strangely enough, because in part wondering what we were going to talk about, but also my own former students of mine were asking me, what did I know of something? And I didn't know enough. I actually have been listening this morning to podcasts about Afghanistan as an international relations question. And again, I'm listening, and I'm a student in that respect. But one of the interesting things that comes up is how Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Turkey, and Russia, and the stands, the various old part of the Soviet Union, the stands, how they see the fall of the American-backed Afghan Republic. Okay. I think it was called the Islamic Republic. I'm not sure. Now it's the Emirate. No, they've given it a new name to it under the Taliban already. But the point is, in some ways, one of my students said to me, "Well, Iran, how does Iran view this in Afghanistan?" I said, "I don't know, but it's also the case they have to worry about refugees in one sense, but it's also the case that merely because they're Islamic republics doesn't necessarily make it a friendly relationship. That's pretty clear." And similarly, Pakistan, which was in some ways a refuge for the Taliban for quite a while. I mean, he said to me, Pakistan's never been a terribly stable place. Will the Taliban have allies that would try to command Pakistan next? And I said, well, the difference is Pakistan has a fierce military, to put it bluntly, a very fierce military.
Super important, because I was thinking, I'm so glad you mentioned this. We're taking this to another level now, but I thought about this the other day. I said, well, the obvious people that I've been at least commenting on that benefit from this scenario, and perhaps the intention by Biden, just to roll back for a second, of him pulling out is not just that he was doing it because Trump had already done this, but there's this weird overlap that they can't say out loud, right? There is much of Trump's foreign policy that mirrors Biden's foreign policy that you can't say out loud. And this is China, right? Yeah. That China's playing this long game. There are folks like Jeffrey Sachs who thinks that there's a lot of folks who think that China's not as powerful, or Russia's not as powerful as we think, but then simultaneously think that America's over. So it's like, well, what does that even mean in the context of the world today? But we say this because China's invested heavily in Afghanistan, using the U.S. military as sort of a protection agent so that they're able to, build pipelines and invest and being very strategic and using, it's how do you use the other world power to advantage, right? Right.
To complicate it more, I would never forget back in the early 70s and the question of the Portuguese colonies in Southern Africa, and who was behind the Marxists in Angola and Mozambique. And in the case of Angola, there were two Marxist forces, one of which was actually being funded by South Africa. So, the world is more complex than we allow for. And cable news doesn't help a lot, obviously. I mean, once upon a time, there were serious programs on television that tried to deal with this. Now, the best you could do is maybe, and people balk when I say this, the best you could do is probably try to catch programs on the BBC, I guess. I mean, something like that.
No.
They have a history of being in these regions, so they have a little more of a perspective on it.
I mean, just in general, as much as corporate media, I'm in Europe right now, as much as corporate media has so much role in media in Europe as well, right? There is less, they don't, because of geography. That's what you're saying. I'm in the Balkans right now, and folks are very familiar with what's happening in the Balkans right now. They're very familiar with Orban. They have a great sense of what's happening in Macedonia, Northern Macedonia. They have a wonderful sense of the transitions that are happening in Albania right now. That's stuff that nobody can get. It doesn't even, is that going to get covered? Maybe on Fareed Zakaria's show, maybe. So just to go back to this, though, because I think Pakistan, and I thought, okay, obviously China is the factor that we're all, Trump wanted to take it to China in a very aggressive way. And I think Biden does too, but he was sort of caught. But again, he could have done something to, I've been evacuated more or less from Libya.
Yeah.
I know they didn't say it to me that way. They just said, you'll be back in a few weeks. And then there was no few weeks. And then literally 2 minutes later, everybody was pulled out.
Yeah, the evacuation is to me, I mean, it's tragic, but it's fascinating to ask these questions. And by the way, the Republicans will not fail to spend incredible hours pushing for investigations. And when the investigations occur in the various committees, they will just go after the Biden administration. But even some of the Democrats are right now asking, what the hell happened?
Which is why we have to win the House and Senate.
Yes.
You cannot. Joe Biden,
that's right.
You don't want to have your you don't want another uprising. You have to put money into the party to win the House and Senate.
And if you're in California, make sure that Newsom, for all of his faults, is not the loser in the recall. But here's the thing. So one of the first thoughts I had, because everyone said, wow, it's collapsing within a week, right? The Taliban are overrunning almost all of the country. There are redoubts that they haven't taken and may not be able to take. But the question I kept saying is, if surely we had the intelligence to know how the Afghan military was probably infiltrated. I mean, all along, what would it take to have? It's all volunteer army. What would it take to have Taliban forces enlist in the military for this very moment? I mean, so the collapse of everyone keeps saying, well, they were untrainable. The fact is that I'm sure the Taliban beautifully, in their terms, infiltrated the Afghan military. And so, and by the way, I could have sworn I heard Biden say something to the effect of, well, we figure, they figure they've got like 10 months or whatever, what months. Well, in other words, it's going to collapse after those months. So Biden probably said to himself, well, it's going to collapse anyhow. Let's just get the hell out now and suffer the consequences. But the thing is that right now, is anybody talking about the progressive agenda that supposedly is being advanced in Congress? I mean, the timing, I don't, God, if you wanted to manipulate, if you want to manipulate, if you want a grand conspiracy, wag the
dog, right?
Right. Yeah. The grand, well, and now you tell me what's going to happen in Congress. I can't speak to it, but it is the case that the collapse came even more fast and furiously than I imagined it was ever going to happen. I thought it would probably take some weeks to happen. But
I don't think this serves, I don't understand. So the grand conspiracy, if this were a wag the dog scenario and you want to distract, Biden doesn't come off looking strong here, just like Obama didn't come off looking strong in his foreign policy.
Here's the other thing to consider. And this is there are signals. That's why I say listening to the BBC. The other day I listened to the BBC and they had a retired American general. And he talked about, no, this is no joke. He talked about it as if, that the whole thing was a disaster. And he was really holding the Biden administration up for ridicule. But then also in the Biden administration, this guy, what's his name? Blinken,
Yeah, Anthony Blinken.
Yeah, he said this isn't Saigon. Well, within 24 hours, the photos were exactly Saigon. I mean, it is confusion. But so here's the thing I ask myself. I don't think the military wanted out so fast. And I just don't get it. I mean, the signals that I've been hearing are that the military didn't want out in this way. And then on top of that, so one of the podcasts I listened to this morning, Deep State Radio, keep that in mind. It's actually a fascinating, I actually find it more interesting to listen to late at night than just about anything.
You're like, can I have a shot?
Because these are people who are inside, they're all inside the Beltway people with.
Oh, it's actual inside the Beltway people.
Oh, all inside the Beltway people.
So you're listening
people
to the
who have been in and out of the administration, people who are associated with the American Enterprise Institute and similar kinds of things, but also people who I believe think of themselves, because this term is totally inapplicable to anyone these days, probably progressive, but they're liberals. Okay, they're not the right wing.
No, these are liberals. These are not like capital L liberals. Not.
But I was listening this morning, and there was a woman speaking to the fact. So her position was, she started off saying, "What a tragedy! I'm heartbroken," and I thought she was going to talk about seeing what people on the street are going through or at the airport. And she said, "We could have," and she talked about we could have stayed on.
Oh my God!
We could have invested. We didn't. We've never invested properly in the enterprise. I mean, it was, and I thought, what? And she's associated with American Enterprises. So there are those neocons their neocons are split, and some of them are now very happy Biden has done what he's done. I mean, David Frum has got to be the funniest guy in DC. David Frum, who was the guy who coined the expression, I believe, axis of evil as a speechwriter, is now sort of, it's as if he has no memory of his own role in the neocon.
No. This is a business. This is a business. Like Harvey,
right, of course it is.
Philosophy. This is a business.
Right.
You stay on track, you're nimble, you shift. This is
and then the
business
Harvard academic, Stephen Walt, who probably knows what he's talking about, said, look, should never have gone in the way we did. We should have gotten out. We had moments where we could have gotten out. Yes. And now we're the tragedy is a consequence of 20 years of what we never should have done. I'm going to say one more thing, because I really would hate to leave the show today without mentioning it. I don't watch Fox, believe me, unless when you're on and you let me know. Okay. But Laura Ingraham, she segued away from the question of Afghanistan on the grand scale, because they all know ultimately that this was as much this is a Republican legacy. I mean, what are we going to do?
Of course.
But she said, do we have an obligation to the tens of thousands of Afghans who want out? I mean, I swear to God, I heard her say that. And that's going to be the question that will now come up. It's going to emerge, because don't forget, what Trump put on the agenda was an anti-immigrant and anti-refugee.
That's right.
Approach.
So this is really interesting. Being in another geopolitical hotspot of Greece, where Russia has always had a dance with Greece, and even though Greece is part of the EU, and simultaneously, Cyprus, obviously not part of Greece, is a very important geopolitical place.
Right, and let's not forget that part of Cyprus was civil war separated out a Turkish Cypriot,
separated or just bulldozed people out of their community. But Turkey is important in this situation as well at this moment. Right. So all of this is happening as Turkey is trying to expand its empire, as Russia is trying to expand its empire, turf war by turf war. As China is trying to expand its empire by buying up ports like the Piraeus port in Greece, by buying up infrastructure across the globe in distressed regions, in conflict regions, and using the American forces as a buffer to continue. Because one thing I don't know how many people know this, but like when the U.S. military is involved in their bases and there's NATO bases, there's more economic development. I'll use Libya as an example.
Right.
Libya started to westernize, and Gaddafi knew that he was going to be going down, and he started putting power and money, support, into his son. And his son started to open up Libya.
There were the two sons, and I'm forgetting which.
Saif and the one that I think died.
One of whom had an association with the London School of Economics that they found a very embarrassing tie. I think it's Saif, but
Saif, yeah, he's supposedly making a comeback. So, but he was the one who started to westernize, opened up the internet. The internet was there for 2 years. Just happened to happen, at a moment when the Arab Spring started, and young people, all these things are factors, right? Yeah. So for folks who think it was in the interest of the U.S. to topple Gaddafi, I fundamentally disagree with that in so many ways. Yeah. They were interested in making a smooth transition from Gaddafi to Saif, because all these Western companies, including oil companies, were investing in Libya. So I say this because now we look at the refugee crisis. I think we all have to sit there and say, which America are we talking about? Which imperialist America are we talking about? The right wing or the neoliberal American imperialism? Because I can't look at the two the same way. They have fundamentally different approaches, both extremely flawed, in my opinion, to how they deal with foreign policy. And so you have a refugee crisis now. The Greek government, the center-right government, has literally decided against humanitarian law to block all refugees and shut down all refugee camps in Greece abruptly, even though it's against the international law. So they're blocking it. So it's all going to be held in Turkey now, putting pressure on Turkey. We have decided under the Biden administration, our numbers are lower than ever, as we're about to see Afghanis. We saw what happened. So how does this, are we putting the pressure on our enemies now? That's what I'm thinking, is the entire US perspective now is put pressure on the forces who are trying to flex their muscles on us. So whether it's NATO or the EU or the US, their goal is, you want this so bad? Cool, you deal with it now. You deal with the refugees, you deal with the infrastructure, you deal with the troops, China, you deal with the refugees, Turkey and Russia. Is that cuckoo?
I assume that's rhetorical to me because what can I say? I mean, I've heard the number floated 60,000. We have an obligation to 60,000. That's the estimate. Okay. And where that number comes from, I don't know. That they say it's those who directly worked with American forces. But then there's the left humanitarian question. And that is, what about the journalists? What about the women? I mean, I'll never forget in the first year or so of the American presence in Afghanistan.
They're expendable, Harvey. That's what they're thinking. They're expendable. I'm sorry to interrupt. Neoliberalism, what I love about neoliberalism is it's always like, it's a slow roll and we have to find ourselves in the middle, unless it comes to foreign policy. They don't care about the women and the children and the reporters. Their neoliberal philosophy goes, they literally just like, we're out, cold, we're out, let them deal with it.
Yeah, well, again, and I don't know what happened on the ground on this, but it is striking that they weren't better prepared. It's shocking that since they made it clear they were leaving, that they weren't already working on that kind of project. But at the same time, I thought, once they began working on that kind of project, okay, to what extent would the Afghan army resist the Taliban too? I mean, I'm sure some IR person, some police action person can put it better. But frankly, the travesty goes 20 years, and the lack of preparation from day one on the part of the Biden administration for what they had to have known. They had to have known what was going to transpire. Joe Biden entered Congress overlapping with Vietnam and the post-Vietnam period. I mean, it's just...
He was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. Come on, guys. and one other thing that we haven't even discussed. ISIS, as much as people thought that ISIS was pretty much disarmed at this point, and not disarmed, but was weakening. Yeah. It's no secret that ISIS and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and ISIS have not necessarily gotten along. Is this some sort of dystopian, grotesque realignment to make sure that the Taliban blocks ISIS, which is more unpredictable and less, top down and uncontrollable? Again, ISIS, their funding, much of it comes from seizing oil fields. Well, but is this sort of like a weird power play? Like if the U.S. forces can't beat the Taliban because nobody in the non-regional world has been able to win a war in Afghanistan ever, then why not use the Taliban to beat ISIS? These are
so how about that? So in that vein, since we're out on a limb here, anyhow.
I've read articles about this.
Who's bankrolling the Taliban and the Taliban regime that will now govern in Afghanistan? I mean, you can't run a government without funds, and the devastation that's been wrought in Afghanistan all these years. There are lots of folks who need to be paid, and there are hospitals that will have to be run. However bad the Taliban vision of the world may seem, they still have to run a government. So who's going to underwrite that government? Will it be Iran? Will it be China to Pakistan into there? I don't know. I mean, again, I always had these sort of strange notions, and I thought, to what extent will the Taliban do their damnedest not to actually alienate the United States now? Okay. Because you can hear the humanitarian organizations saying to themselves, we've got to get money into Afghanistan, or it's going to be not simply a Taliban nightmare, it's going to be a humanitarian nightmare. I mean, it's just all of these. Right now, we're in the middle of something which we don't know the answers, because you and I don't wield power, and we're not sitting in on the behind closed doors meetings.
I'm the head of NATO.
Well, I'm sure
NATO
there. I'm
commander,
sure there are
Harvey Kaye. I don't know if you've read the internet or the Gray Zones videos on me, but I was personally at 22 years old with my 3 roommates in the other room.
These visions of various. I remember our conversations. In fact, you bet.
Listen, that button. When I was 22 years old and Libya was being bombed, and I was the NATO commander, I was operating from my 4-bedroom apartment with my 3 roommates in the other room, and I was just sitting in the corner. I could go into my closet. And I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to say this online. I messed up. God, I'm so tempted at times
to
share all this
is wherever Nomiki resides.
Right now, I'm residing in a children's room. Bunk beds in the corner.
People know if they've only come on at this moment onto the YouTube, that those are children's ornaments behind you. They're not tokens of the devil or anything like that.
No, they're like those. Remember those like shrunken heads that you'd find at the museums when you?
Oh yeah.
Oh my God, those fascinating.
Or they sold them readily.
You lived where?
In Ecuador.
Oh, in Ecuador, they still. I'm sorry.
The Shivaro Indians. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. They were known for their head shrinking practices. So tourists they weren't real shrunken heads people were buying, at least none that I was aware of. But they created these, mock shrunken heads so that tourists could buy them to take them home. Okay,
it's romantic, honey.
Oh, truly.
I went to Ecuador.
I was 15 at the time, so.
That was around the age, like when I would go to these museums, I was so fascinated by that.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So they're in the background. It's just, there's a rhinoceros, there's a deer, there's a pig, there's a giraffe, and there is an elephant.
I love it. I do love it. It's gorgeous, actually.
And they're pastel colors.
You might actually want to buy one of those too. So when you resituate at the next power center, you could have... That could
Listen, when you're in NATO, you have to be on the road.
Yeah.
I got to tell you, they've demoted me from commander because they were like, listen, women cannot be running NATO when the Taliban could target you. So
I will
we're going to demote you.
I will tell you, I have a very dear friend who was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, and she was a woman.
Oh my God. But she was deputy. She was not lead, because then you're a target.
Right.
When I was lead of, I don't even know what they're called.
It's a friendship that goes back 50 years.
We should have her on and we should talk about what it really means to run NATO. And we should entitle it Dear Cuckoo Faux Left, who's trying to...
Right.
I'm sorry if you... Oh God, I can't
Yeah, well, again, I want to tell people I'm going to tell people that it's not a bad idea, given the times in which we live, to do something which will seem very high schoolish. But if you have a free wall in your house, go get a world map and put it up. And every time you think, and just put it up, okay? That's what I told my students all the time. Just put up a world map in your dorm room or wherever else. I guarantee it'll remind you that the world just isn't as simple as even I will perhaps present it to you.
And I don't recommend The West Wing ever, but there is one episode of The West Wing regarding maps, which is a really famous episode where when the guy came in, the map lobbyist, and was like, the maps are not accurate. We are so small. And Africa is like 17 times larger than us.
Right.
And we need to change the maps. And
so
when you get your little map, make sure it's accurate.
Well, the first thing that I told them, this was on a limited basis, I said, and when you buy the map, because once upon a time in the United States, you couldn't get a map that didn't have the United States in the middle and broke up Asia.
Yeah.
And so at least now, world maps, put US in the middle, and they had the Atlantic and the Pacific. And so basically East Asia would show up separate from Central Asia. So just make sure if you do have a world map that you've got one that does not have the United States in the middle. Okay. Don't do that.
That would be great. That would be a great lesson in this moment.
Right.
We are not the center of the world, despite our attempts. All right. Fascinating conversation.
No, I'll just tell you, I look forward to the time where this pandemic isn't resurging and we can go get a drink in Astoria, Queens. I
cannot wait. And I look forward to also having you in studio. Before we get those drinks.
Right.
So we can have a long
I
conversation.
don't know if people realize we only got to meet in person literally like weeks before the country essentially shut down.
Yeah.
It was like
Michael's event,
and then we got
event.
together the next day for, a coffee and stuff like that. So,
and since then we've just had hours.
And I feel like I've known you forever. That's kind of funny.
I feel the same way.
Yeah. Right.
That's one good thing that's coming from this. Yeah.
I don't know if you've already cut off the taping of this or not, but
no, we're still going.
Oh, we are. Okay.
This is the best part.
As far as I'm concerned, but
I mean, Afghanistan's
because
hard,
I know
guys.
you better than I know Central Asia.
Listen, all we got to do to brainwash Americans is just create a map where Asia's split so they think that we are bigger than Asia. And then we just shrink Africa and make it look like they're just like a little thing. And that's how you break everyone. Listen, California is the size of Africa. That's it. That's it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Right. Texas is the side of Africa. It's the Sahara Desert. It's like Rhode Island. That's all it is. That's how you win them over. And then you just give talking points to Joe Rogan, who's like, I don't know. I mean, do we really know how big Morocco is? Or like, I mean, it could be just as large as he's basically a father.
Right. And speaking of Morocco, since that's where all the films about the Middle East and East Central Asia and all the films about this take place. Right now, Hollywood has hired innumerable script writers, has already reserved hotel rooms in Morocco because they're going to reproduce, right? Guaranteed, they're going to reproduce the pullout in Hollywood terms. And there'll be the story of some American unit that refuses to leave Afghanistan until they can get into central Afghanistan and help some family escape.
Liberate
Yeah.
Listen, Hollywood, if you're going to do that, maybe take care of your own America. We have desert in the US. So if you're going to do propaganda, the Moroccan people are lovely, but we need jobs in the US. So support your unionized film crew when you're producing your propaganda. Okay.
Yeah.
Simple as that.
A good idea.
Harvey Kaye, you're the best.
Thank you. You're the best, actually.
We got to talk about this. I mean, this is such a big topic, so maybe we'll do it again very soon.
Or if not on air, off.
Yes. Oh, I have an idea for next cycle because producer Brad has mentioned about a bunch of things that we didn't get to. It's just such a big topic. But next time around, if you're down, can we talk about like the legacy of the Nazis and whether or not they really went away or didn't? And because just something. I know it's a big topic, but it comes up a lot in like comments and chats and obviously with Latin American. You're
funny. As soon as you said that, my mind went to Argentina and right.
But simultaneously, I want to ask you another question, which just to marinate on, it's like a teaser for the next time you come on. Is the foreign policy of today, in terms of the multidimensionalism and how complicated the alignments are, similar to World War, like the lead up to World War I and post World War I versus World War II, which is obviously the lines were much clearer?
Wow, that's a good question. I really should think about that. I really, really should. Okay.
You would know. I don't know. I'm just
that's it.
As you're describing it, I was like, I can't figure out where we are. And
if you think about it on a grander scale, I mean, there is this scramble. You brought up China. I mean, you're down in the Balkan region. There's this great story coming out of Montenegro about the highway that the Chinese underwrote, and basically the government, the leadership is they literally bankrupted Montenegro because of this. The Chinese loaned money. The Chinese sent the builders. The Chinese, it's literally bankrupting. It's bankrupted Montenegro. Yeah. So let's not, these alternate sources of monies and power. I don't welcome I'll be honest, and I don't give a shit what people think. I don't welcome the collapse of the American empire. I think there's ways it should happen and ways it definitely should not. And right now we are positioned for the worst case scenario. And you mentioned World War I and I think that's, I'll be honest.
I mean, there's no good guy who's, Karl Marx
No,
is
I'll put it this way.
not sitting in the Paris Commune.
A friend of mine back in grad school said to me, if you think that imperialism is the question, which in part I did, I connected peasants and their lives to Wall Street in some grand argument I made in a graduate seminar. He said, you ought to really be putting all your attention into American politics and not into worrying about politics on the ground in Latin America. And that stuck with me. And I actually believe that the first task of the left is to think in terms of how does the left secure a much stronger voice. Bernie Sanders is getting up there. Okay. Yeah. But how do we secure a much stronger voice? How do we make the Democratic Party the Democratic Party? Because there has to be a force that can literally command. We've got to be in a position to shape whatever transformations are coming, even if it's going to be over a long haul, not an immediate haul. And at my age, I probably won't see the long haul, obviously. But it's the case that, if anyone thinks that the alternative is China or Russia or forget it. I mean, ask the folks in Western China what they think about Beijing. Okay, ask masses of people in Russia what they have to think about Moscow. Okay,
ask journalists, ask dissenters, ask
the Chechens how. So.
Being the Balkan,
stop thinking one-dimensionally. We've got to stop thinking 100%. One-dimensionally. That's all.
Okay, so with that being said, I feel like the one of the divides in terms of leftist foreign policy behaviors that are taking place right now is there's this romanticism with creating conditions that were literally 100 years ago with Paris Commune. And even that was romantic, reinventing that. And the conditions of today.
Which was crushed, by the way. Let people realize that.
Exactly. So we are sitting with the conditions of today. And if we want to get back to the roots of our philosophy, it's like, how do we change the material conditions? And the reality of today is you do have world powers and emerging second-rate world powers. Yeah. And if you want to, I think the way you're posing is, do we want to destroy American empire entirely and what is left as a result? Or do we want to use an electoral system to shift the way that American empire exists? But American empire...
That's a good way. That's at least a starting point.
It's either gone and something else comes. I mean, it's not like we can force Russia to suddenly become a communist. it's like
they tried that.
If you want to dismantle the American empire, then you have to make sure that China and Pakistan, all these world powers are also Marxist, and they're not. And this is what I'm grappling with: is how do we make our conditions we're taking care of our people, not at the expense, not creating whatever stability that our empire believes in at the expense of our own people. And so that's my philosophy is we don't,
yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's hard. There's so many places that can go towards, my mind right now is, how do we get the fucking infrastructure plan passed? Right. So at least we can move from there to something. And right now, Biden's popularity is at least in a short-term decline. The Republicans will do what they can. If California gets a Republican governor, Jesus, that.
You mean right? Republican radio host?
Will the Eric Adams election be the foretelling of the California governor election? It's that kind of thing.
They do both have extremely low turnout, and that's something we have to keep in mind. Is like when turnout's that low, Republicans bank on it. Okay.
Yeah, but okay. I'm getting
lots to think about. Time. Listen, if we don't pass the infrastructure bill, I hear China's got a really great bid on us.
I gotta go.
All right. Oh, you gotta go? Okay.
No, awesome. I can't even begin to respond to that one. I'm remembering the question of, because the Chinese would probably love to take our harbors. Hell, most of the stuff pouring into them, at least on the West Coast, comes from China. So
don't worry. Steve Bannon has a plan for that. And then he's just going to make sure all the little indentured servants, aka the millennials and the Gen Zers, are the ones doing the grunt work. The brunt work. Brunt.
And if people, I'm going to leave with one thought. I promise.
Brunt while they grunt.
What would the story have been if Bernie had been elected? Boom.
Oh, geez.
Okay, that's the fantasy for the day. It's killing me to have to cut this off, but
bye.
But you need me to cut this off.
I have to. Thank our listeners got extra content, so that's all that matters. Harvey Kaye, you're the best. We could talk for 3 hours.
Got extra content or discontent, whatever it is. Bye. Thank you so much.
We should start a segment called "What Would Have Happened If Bernie Won."
We can start a whole what if series of segments. You bet.
It's actually just a show.
That's right.
Hey, patrons, if you want to see the show, please join us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show.
Yeah,
Type it in, and we will create an actual show called "What Would Have Happened If Bernie Won?" What if Bernie won on healthcare, on infrastructure, on
foreign policy,
obviously. The Mideast.
On free college. I mean, blah, 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 blah. Right?
Oh my God, we could do this for 10 years.
You bet.
Harvey,
okay,
this is how we're going to become millionaires.
Actually, I have some ideas about that.
We could get taxed the hell out of.
I've passed up every opportunity to become a millionaire, and I don't even know if I should think about it now. So,
wow, I passed up every opportunity to become a millionaire. Listen, the NATO people understand the minimum wage at NATO is it's subpar. They have a great brunch. You might get bombed in the hotel that you're staying at because it's a Target. But listen, that buffet, the cheese, oh my God, the cheese is amazing. But
okay, I just want people to know
we're
speaking right now on Wednesday. Wednesday is sushi night in my household.
Oh, you make sushi?
Well, the local store actually they have these two people who make sushi, and the size of the fish is big, the rice is great. It's great, and I found a place where I could actually get green tea ice cream. So,
and mochi.
It's a mocha green tea ice cream.
Ooh.
Yeah, and it's.
And what about your Japanese whiskey? I know you've been into that lately.
There's a bottle downstairs, but my wife doesn't drink whiskey, so we drink champagne.
Champagne socialist.
Well, it's Spanish. Let me make it clear.
It's cava.
Spanish. It's cava. It's not right.
Working class champagne.
It's working class. Exact. Thank you. I'm glad you realized.
Much better, by the way. Cava is so
champagne.
Much better.
It is cava, Freixenet, in fact. So
you can get cava for like €3 in Europe as long as you're not in Greece.
Yeah. Okay.
Greeks are like, that's it. Just
I gotta go eat some lunch.
Have a nice day.
It's still a while till you eat dinner, but it's my lunchtime.
I know. It just so everybody knows, it's 8:23 p.m. here. I have dinner in an hour and a half.
I wish I were there.
Thank you to Professor Harvey Kaye for joining us for this very lively conversation. And thank you to everybody who watches our show and listens to our show on all the different places, including patreon.com/The Nomiki Show, where you're patrons. And if you are one of our lovely patrons, you might even be able to get swag like the Nomiki Show mug that Harvey Kaye is holding right now. I don't know what he has in that mug, but mugs can cover up a lot. So can bags like the Nomiki Show bag.
It covers up a lot.
The Nomiki Show sticker. So join us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. But seriously, thank you to everybody for tuning in. We will see you on Friday for From Friday. And for patrons, I think you're getting a little something extra because we don't shut up over here. All right. Stay in solidarity. Take care.
The Nomiki Show. Clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.